I'm almost 60 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been interested in presidential politics. I think my first recollections were really of Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then, of course, the assassination of the president. But I have to admit that the presidency in the last 6 years and a few presidents preceding the current one has left my interest in presidential politics severely strained. But the history of Washington, D.C. and the politics that take place there are really quite fascinating. And the White House itself, a national symbol, of course, has a very interesting and unusual history. When the Founding Fathers began making plans for the nation's capital in 1789, they couldn't agree on a location. The Northerners, of course, wanted a northern city to serve as the capital, and the Southerners, of course, also wanted a southern city. Finally, they compromised. Instead of establishing the capital in an existing city, they'd create a new one from scratch, and they'd build it somewhere in the middle of the country, not too far north and not too far south. On July 12, 1790, President Washington signed an act of Congress declaring that on the first Monday in December 1800, the federal government would move to the new federal district not exceeding 10 miles square on the River Potomac. Philadelphia would serve as a temporary capital until then. But the act didn't say exactly where on the Potomac the new city should be. A lot more arguing took place before Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson and Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton finally agreed on a 10-mile by 10-mile area of farmland and swamps, a mile east of Georgetown, Maryland, and just over the Potomac from Arlington, Virginia. Maryland and Virginia donated the land, and George Washington hired engineer Pierre L'Enfant, a friend of Jefferson, to lay out the new city. Washington also appointed 3 federal district commissioners to oversee the work that was to be done on the new capital. One of their first decisions, they named the new city Washington, although for the rest of his life, George Washington insisted on calling the city the Federal District. Since the idea of a president was so new, most European countries were still ruled by royalty, and nobody really knew what a president's house should look like. So in 1792, Thomas Jefferson took out a newspaper ad offering $500 to the architect who could come up with the best design for a president's house, with George Washington making the final decision. Newspaper contests were an unusual way to solicit architectural designs, even in the 1790s, but Jefferson figured it was the only way to guarantee that the architect would be chosen based on the merits of his design and not on favoritism or connections. Jefferson probably came to regret the newspaper contest idea because he entered his own plans in the contest under the pseudonym Mr. A.Z. and lost. George Washington admired the work of architect James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who had designed the state capital of South Carolina, and Washington encouraged Hoban to enter the contest, and then he decided in Hoban's favor. Hoban's design called for a 3-story mansion and, as asked, included plans for wings that could be added on later when the time came, but they were never built. He set his dimensions of the presidential palace at 170 feet long, 85 feet deep, and 3 stories high. Washington thought Hoban's building was beautiful, but he also complained that it was too small. He suggested increasing its size by about 20%, since that would have cost a fortune. The suggestion was politely ignored. Hoban estimated that the president's house would cost about $400,000 to build, but no one knew how to pay for it. George Washington thought he could raise the funds through the sale of building lots in the federal district, but building an entire city from the ground up in the middle of farm and swamplands for a republic barely 10 years old seemed such an impossible undertaking that many people doubted whether the city would ever actually really be built. In fact, the new city was a laughing stock of New York and Philadelphia. The state of Pennsylvania had even begun building its own permanent federal buildings in the expectation that Washington, D.C. would eventually be abandoned. In the face of such skepticism, A few of the District of Columbia's lots that sold at all sold at much lower prices than anticipated. So the planners had to cut corners. The third floor of the president's house was eliminated, as were the north and south porticos, the large columned overhangs that were planned for the front and rear of the building. The marble fireplaces that had been ordered were canceled and replaced with simpler ones made of wood. The presidential palace was becoming less palatial. The cornerstone for the president's house was laid on October 13th, 1792, and nobody knows for sure where the exact location was because nobody took the time to record it, and work on the 4-foot-thick walls began, outer walls. They were built by masons and slave laborers, all of whom lived in shanties on the property because there was no place else in the yet-as-to-be-built city in which they could live. And at one point, a brothel was set up on the White House grounds for their convenience. The exterior would be faced with freestones, a form of sandstone that was chosen because it can be cut like marble. But freestone is also very porous and is highly susceptible to water damage. So the masons sealed the stones with a wash of salt, rice, and glue. It was the building's first coat of white paint soon that would cause the nickname of the White House. Work on Washington, D.C. was moving along slowly due to the shortage of skilled labor and raw materials, and especially dollars, thanks to the disappointing land sales in the district and a Congress that was reluctant to commit any extra money. The White House had more than its share of its own problems. Despite all the cuts that had been made, it was still way over budget, and when the Congress learned in 1798 how much money had been spent, it refused to pay any more. When the roof was finished, the building was sealed up and abandoned, sitting empty for more than a year until new funds could be raised to pay for the interior. When work resumed, an architect named Benjamin Henry Latrobe examined the structure to determine its structural soundness. He found that the structural timbers, which weren't the highest quality of wood to begin with, had been exposed to so much cold, dampness, and rain during the 7 years of construction that they were now dangerously decayed. But there was no money to replace them, so Latrobe repaired them as best he could, and work on the house was continued. By now, the White House was hopelessly behind schedule. We do not believe it will be possible to prepare the building for the reception of the President until October or November next, the commissioners wrote in February 1800. George Washington didn't even live to see the finished White House, let alone live in it. He left office in 1797 and died 2 years later, at about the same time the exterior walls were completed. The White House was still unfinished when Washington's successor, John Adams, arrived in Washington, D.C., but he moved in anyway on November 1st, 1800. The rest of the federal government, which consisted of 130 federal employees, moved to the new capital a month later. Unfinished is a polite way to describe the condition of the White House. The roof leaked, the ceilings were crumbling, and the windows were so loose that rain and wind blew in just about every room. Not one room or chamber is finished, First Lady Abigail Adams wrote. It is habitable only by fires in every part. This is such an inconvenience that I know not what to do. The White House didn't even have an enclosed yard, so she took to hanging her wet laundry in the unfinished East Room. The exterior looked even worse. As Ethel Lewis writes in the White House, the grounds were strewn with dump heaps, old brick kilns, and water holes giving off evil odors. It looked more like a ruin than a presidential palace. And the workers, enslaved laborers, were still living in shanties on the lawn, and it would be nearly a month before the White House even had an outhouse. But the Adamses would suffer for only 4 months. In 1800, Adams lost the presidential election to his political rival Thomas Jefferson, and Adams avenged the defeat 3 different ways. 1. He stayed up late on Inauguration Eve, appointing judges that he thought would be embarrassing to Jefferson. 2. He boycotted the inauguration the following morning. And 3. He moved out of the White House as required, which meant that Jefferson would have to move into it. Jefferson preferred to stay at Monticello whenever possible, but he also did a lot to improve the White House. He removed the shanties, landscaped the grounds, installed a fence, and filled the mansion with fashionable furniture. And for safety's sake, mixed in with the fine furniture, Ethel Lewis writes, were 8 fire buckets. By the time Jefferson left office in 1809, the White House was finally a comfortable home, though not by today's standards. There was no electricity, of course, or telephones, or central heating, or air conditioning, and there was only the most primitive system of running water designed by Jefferson himself. There weren't even any closets. In those days, few people owned more than a cedar chest full of clothes, and building closets were unheard of. By the 19th century standards, the White House would do just fine, but not for long. In 1814, British soldiers burned it to the ground, leaving the mansion's white stone walls an empty shell. At first, most Americans didn't think there was anything particularly special about the White House. Few had ever seen it or had any idea what it looked like, and even the families who lived there found it completely inadequate. When it was built, the White House was the largest house in the country, and it remained so until after the Civil War. But it served so many different purposes that little of it was available for the first family to actually live in. The first floor, or state floor, was made up entirely of public rooms, and half of the second floor was taken up by the president's offices, which were staffed by as many as 30 employees. The first family had to get by with 8 or fewer second-floor rooms that were left. By Lincoln's time, the situation was intolerable. Kenneth Leish writes in The White House, "The lack of privacy was appalling. The White House was open to visitors daily, and office seekers, cranks, and the merely curious had no difficulty making their way upstairs from the official rooms on the first floor." Lincoln was so uncomfortable with the situation that he had a private corridor, which has since been removed, constructed. This at least allowed him to get from the family quarters to his office without having to pass through the reception room, where throngs of strangers were usually waiting to see him. He also received a $20,000 appropriation to improve the furnishings of the White House, which had become, as one visitor put it, bare, worn, and spoiled, like a deserted farmstead, with holes in the carpets and paint peeling off the walls in the staterooms. Lincoln was busy with the Civil War, of course, so he turned the matter over to his wife, who spent every penny of this $6,000 and went $6,700 over budget. Lincoln was furious at that, and he refused to ask Congress to cover the balance. It would stink in the nostrils of American people, he fumed, to have it said that the President of the United States had approved a bill overrunning an appropriate amount for flub-dubs for this damned old house when the soldiers cannot even have blankets. The new furnishings did not last for more than a few years. When Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the White House fell into disarray. Apparently, writes the White House Historical Society, no one really supervised the White House during the 5 weeks Mrs. Lincoln lay mourning in her room, and vandals came in and helped themselves. Ironically, at the same time the White House was being ransacked, it was gaining a new respect with Americans, attaining an almost shrine-like status. National tragedy turned the White House into a national monument, and it wasn't just the White House anymore. It was the place where the great fallen hero Lincoln had lived. Photography had only been invented about 30 years earlier, but now for the first time photos of the White House circulated around the country. It became a symbol of the presidency and a symbol of America. And the Founding Fathers had assumed that future presidents would add to or even demolish and rebuild the official residence as they saw fit. But after 1865, no president would have dared to suggest tearing it down. James Madison was president from 1809 to 1817, and the first and so far the only president to be burned out of the White House and home. was James Madison during the War of 1812. On August 24th, 1814, 4,000 British troops marched on Washington, D.C., setting fire to the Capitol building, the White House, and just about everything else they could torch. Madison wasn't home at the time. He was either out directing troops or running away. But his wife, Dolly Madison, hung in there and managed to remove the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington before the British arrived and gutted the building. Washington, D.C. suffered so much damage that there was serious talk of moving the capital to some other city. But it stayed put, of course, and the White House was rebuilt. But not before Madison left office. For about a year, he ran the country from the Octagon House, the residence of the French minister, and later from a house at 19th Street and Pennsylvania Avenue. Madison's successor, James Monroe, moved back into the White House in 1817. Martin Van Buren was president from 1837 to 1841, and President Van Buren had the misfortune of being the person who moved into the White House right after it was vacated by President Andrew Jackson, probably the most raucous president ever to live there. He had inherited a White House in a pretty sorry state of repair, Ethel Lewis writes in the White House. The walls were all grimy with smoke, the floor coverings had had more than their share of tobacco juice, and most of the china and silver and glass had been broken. Van Buren spent $60,000 on cleaning, whitewashing, and furniture repairs for the White House, only to have Congressman Charles Ogle from Jackson's own Whig Party attack the newfound regal splendor of the presidential palace, citing such wretched excuses as bracket lights, ice cream vases, and the president's private bathtub. Van Buren spent less on the White House than Jackson had, but Ogle's attacks contributed to his losing the 1840 presidential election to William Henry Harrison. James Buchanan was president from 1857 to 1861, and by the middle of the 19th century, Washington, D.C. had grown into a city with 50,000 people, but it had no sewage treatment facilities, which resulted in a serious sanitation problem for the city. The problem was so bad near the White House, Ethel Lewis writes that there was a serious consideration of removing the president's home to a more salutary place and using the present building for offices only. Up to 1850, sewers from the public buildings emptied onto the open ground south of the White House. There, the water stagnated and made a marsh. Immediately following Buchanan's inauguration, several residents of the National Hotel and its neighborhood died as a result of poison gases from an obstructed and inadequate sewer system. Chester Arthur was president from 1881 to 1885. And President James A. Garfield lived long enough to install the White House's first elevator for his Grandma Garfield, but that was about it. He was assassinated 4 months into his term, and Vice President Chester A. Arthur became president. Unlike his plain predecessor, Arthur was a dandy who kept up with the latest fashions. He was so appalled at the conditions of the White House that he refused to move in, even in time of crisis, Garfield's death, until the White House was redecorated to his taste. On April 15, 1881, 24 wagon loads of White House furnishings were carried away and sold at auction to the highest bidder. Items sold included cuspidors, hair mattresses, marble mantles, a globe that had belonged to President Grant's daughter, and a pair of Lincoln's pants. Arthur then hired New York artist and decorator Louis Comfort Tiffany to redecorate from floor to ceiling. Tiffany transformed the old mansion into an artful palace. Kenneth Leash writes, "Throughout the house, everything that could be sprayed with gold was, everything that could be overstuffed was, and every space that could hold a potted plant held too." Arthur finally took up residence in the White House in December of 1881. Now, in 1889 to 1892, Benjamin Harrison was president, and living in the White House must have been particularly difficult for Harrison, who shared the 5-bedroom residence with his wife, her 90-year-old father, her sister, a niece, the Harrisons' 2 daughters and son, the son's wife and daughter, and 2 other infants. There were 5 bedrooms in the residence at that time, so it's not surprising that First Lady Carolyn Harrison was a strong proponent of enlarging the White House. In 1891, Mrs. Harrison had an architect draw up plans adding an enormous wing to each end of the White House. The ends of the 2 wings would be connected by a long conservatory, creating an enclosed courtyard in the back of the White House. Inside the courtyard, Mrs. Harrison proposed would be a fountain commemorating Columbus's discovery of the New World and the laying of the White House cornerstone 300 years later. And the best part of all, at least as far as Mrs. Harrison was concerned, was that there would be plenty of room on the upper floors of the new wings for additional bedrooms and office space. Mrs. Harrison's plans might well have succeeded if President Harrison hadn't offended the Speaker of the House, Thomas Reed, the Czar of Capitol Hill, by refusing to appoint one of Reed's cronies to the government job. Reed was so angry that he prevented the White House bill from ever coming to vote. The Harrisons, all 12 of them, stayed put for 4 years. In 1901 to 1908, Theodore Roosevelt was president, and Roosevelt, who became president when McKinley was assassinated, was determined to enlarge the White House to suit the needs of both the growing country and his growing family, which numbered 6 children. Roosevelt added the West Wing, which houses the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, the White House Press Office, and other executive offices. Because the West Wing was built only 1 story high and was separated from the rest of the mansions by a long corridor, the appearance of the White House changed very little. Roosevelt's distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, added the East Wing during World War II, and it contained 3 stories of office space, including new offices for the First Lady and the White House's first bomb shelter. In 1944 to 1952, Harry Truman served as president. In 1948, he authorized an expenditure of $10,000 to have a balcony installed on the south side of the second floor of the White House. He had barely gotten around to enjoying it when he became the first president since James Madison to evacuate the White House out of fear for his life. Found the White House falling down, he wrote in his diary, "My daughter's sitting room floor had broken down into the family dining room." Truman had lived in the White House long enough to know that it wasn't in the best of shape. The floor in the upstairs study swayed and creaked when you walked across it, and the chandelier in the Blue Room swung back and forth for no reason. But he was astonished at what structural engineers told him. The beams that held the building up had been cut into so many times and were carrying so much more weight than they had been designed to carry that they had begun to split under the strain. The entire building was on the verge of collapse. The family quarters on the second floor were particularly in bad shape, and they were being held up purely by habit, the engineer told Truman. Truman had 3 choices: move away and have the White House designated a museum, tear the White House down and build a replica in its place, or 3, save the exterior walls, tear down everything else, and replace it with an exact replica of the original interior. Truman chose the third option and moved across the street to Blair House, normally the government's guest house for visiting heads of state. According to Kenneth Leash, mantelpieces, wall paneling, fixtures, moldings, all were taken apart and stored away for later reinstallation. Then the whole interior was demolished. Steel beams were erected to support the new interior. The entire structure was fireproofed and air-conditioned, and the outer walls were shored up. It took 4 years and more than $5 million, but when Truman moved back in 1952, the presidential mansion was, as Abigail Adams had said too optimistically 150 years earlier, built for the ages to come. And that's just a few little interesting facts about the home of our presidents, the White House in Washington, D.C. Thank you for taking the time to listen.